Hello everyone, Angelica here. Welcome back to my channel. I have 3 cards to share with you today featuring a stamp set from Colorado Craft Company's newest release. It's been a while since I've used my Copic markers, so I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to pick some colors out and make a coloring video. I'm going to be chatting throughout the video and I've got some tips and color combinations to share. But before we get started, let's take a look at the new Anita Jeram stamp sets. Starting with Watch This, this stamp set has 3 adorable dogs and 5 birthday sentiments. There's also coordinating dies, which are sold separately. Next up is Hedgehog Day. This is a really fun neutral stamp set. The sentiments are perfect to use throughout the year, and the hedgehogs are just absolutely precious. I'm in love with this next stamp set, Home Sweet Home. There's one large image and then smaller images from the scene so you can build your own or die cut them and pop them up on the larger image. Lots of possibilities with this set, and I'm really excited to create with this one. And again, there are coordinating dies available for purchase. The last stamp set is Coffee House, and this is what I picked for today's cards. I couldn't resist this set. I live in the Seattle area, and coffee is everywhere here. This 6x8 stamp set has 7 images and 6 fabulous coffee sentiments. And of course, the coordinating dies are available for purchase too. I used my MISTI to stamp all the images onto Express It blending card with Gina K chocolate truffle amalgam ink. And now we're just going to jump right into coloring. I'm starting the coloring with a ground shadow. I used T6, T4, T2, and T0. I actually used this gray combination on all 3 of my cards. I wanted all the cards to be really clean and simple, so the ground shadow is all I'm doing for a background. I'm coloring the scene as if the light source is coming from my left, so I'm drawing those shadow lines long on the right side of the mug and mouse. For the mice, I'm using one of my favorite skin combinations, E04, E11, E21, and E00. Just like the ground shadow, the darkest areas will be on the right side of the mice, starting with a line of E04, where I want it to be the darkest. Now with my E11 marker, I will start flicking a small amount of color towards the left sides of the mice. I'm putting the nib of my E11 marker onto that E04 line, and doing this immediately starts releasing the E11 ink into the E04 line. And since I'm doing this pretty quickly, the E04, the darker ink, is still wet. So the 2 colors are actually blending together on their own as soon as I put that E11 marker onto the paper. Now, flicking the ink out just a little bit is breaking up that really sharp dark line. I also used the flicks from the E11 marker to start giving the mice a shape, making a shape with their bellies so it's a bit round by the way that I was flicking out the ink. Moving on to the E21 marker, I'm again almost starting at the E04 color, grabbing that ink and flicking it forward. Still trying to do kind of a curve look with my flicks so it's not just a flat color. And then I will be finishing up the mice with the E00 marker, just blending out all of those colors together. And I'm going to leave a little bit of just the white from the paper on the very left edge of the mice instead of bringing in a white gel pen later on for some highlights. I'm finishing up the mice with R20 and R00 for their ears, hands and feet, and also their tails. Now, I know I talked pretty fast through that coloring process for the mice. I'm going to color the mice again with the next card, and I promise I will slow down now that you kind of saw why I was doing what I was doing. I wanted to just get that out first. Moving on to the teacup, I'm using my gray markers to keep the cup and saucer looking white. Coloring shadows on the cup will make it look a lot more truer than not adding any color at all. I'm only using T2 and T0, my lightest grays, and I'm adding slanted shadows to the cup and saucer. Starting in the right bottom corner of the teacup, I'm coloring at a slant towards the upper left, which helps shape the cup. I do kind of the same with the saucer. I'm adding a little bit of a curve at the end of my strokes to round the plate. I don't do a lot of flicking with my colors here since they're pretty light. The colors are pretty light, and I just need a little gray for shadows. I'm going to finish the panel with E49 and E47 for the coffee, and we'll move on to the next card. I have this part of the video sped up quite a bit, and I will explain why in just a moment. Starting with the mice, I used T2 and T0 to add gray shadows to them to keep them white. And then I'm going to move on to the French press, again using my T grays. In fact, I used a lot of gray on this panel. Before I got to the coffee, the only other color that I did use was R20 and R00 for the ears, tails, paws. I think I called them hands before. The paws and feet. So from the mice being gray and the gray French press, I colored the ground gray. I either had to keep the coffee gray and have the pink tail and whatnot be the only other color on the panel, or I was going to have to break up the gray big time. So I decided to not start a new panel. I used the gray colors as an undercoat, and it's amazing how the gray undertones really changed each top color. The coffee colors that I used were E49, E47, and E44. I drew kind of a crooked line with the E49 down each side of the French press, leaving a slight area of white between the stamped line and the colored line. And I used small flicks of E49 to bring that color out a little bit, and add a slight curve also, just to round that pot up. I used E47 to draw the color out even more towards the center, and then E44 is what I used to close up the middle. On the back of the stamp packaging, you can find coloring examples for some of the images that are in the stamp set. This French press is an example on the back packaging for this stamp set, and the illustrator left a little bit of open white space in the coffee for a highlight. I didn't do that for my image, though I think it would have looked great if I did. I just didn't look at the back of the package until after I had colored it. So just a reminder, there's always inspiration to be found on the back of the packaging. I'm finishing up the French press with BG70 on the glass, and then I'm going to be moving on to recoloring the scene again. I'm using E04, E11, E21, and E00 for the mice again, starting with drawing my E04 line and coming in with the E11 to get those inks mixed together and start bringing them out towards the left side of the mice. Since I wasn't too sure how this would turn out, I just colored pretty quickly, and I colored more in up and down lines than with flicking. And I actually liked the way that the coloring, not blending the colors out too much with flicking. I liked the texture that it gave the card panel. For the French press, I picked B37, B45, and B41 for the top blue colors. I pretty much followed my gray coloring with the blue markers, using the darkest blue over the darkest gray, so on and so on to finish the press. I know I've used the word flicking a lot, and to those who might not know what that means, let me try to explain it quickly. When I put my marker nib on the paper, I'm going to move it in one direction, and before I stop, I'm going to lift my marker off the page, and this leaves a softer end line. When I color fast and I'm flicking with each stroke, it makes it so much easier to blend the next color that I want to use. I talk about this more in another video, and I'll leave a link to that video if you want to learn more about flicking, and I show it in a slower process too, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. My last panel is probably my favorite. This scene is so cute with the spilled beans and the mouse juggling beans. I used the same brown colors as I did for the coffee, E49, E47, and E44. I colored all the beans with E44, then added quick lines of the darker browns for shading, and then I went back over those lines with E44 again just to blend them out a bit. Now, when I start coloring, I rarely have a color scheme picked, as you saw with the last panel. So while I was coloring these beans, I was trying to figure out what colors I wanted for the bags. I had already used blues, and I always use reds when I'm coloring. So I decided to go with orange, and I went bold. Orange is not a color I use too often, but I do have a color combination that I love to use when I do use orange. So I picked E09, YR18, YR14, and YR12 to use. And I used E09 to map out where I wanted the creases in the bag. I used the stamp lines to show me where the creases should be. So anywhere where I saw a V in the line, where the V was going into the bag, I added the E09. I used the V line whenever I wanted to add a crease. And I do this with a dress when I add pleats or with flower petals, anything. The illustrator they use their line drawings to show where those creases should be, and it took me a while to read those lines. So if you want to start adding creased shadows, draw a dark line where the V heads into your image and then work around it with your lighter colors. You'll definitely want to practice first. I probably colored the same image 20 times before I started to understand the how the shading works and the illustrator lines. Now, if you want to learn more about what I'm talking about and how to shade those creases, leave me a comment below and I'll make a video on how to color pleated skirts, flower petals, leaves, etc. Now, by no means am I an expert, but I'm definitely better than I was a year ago. And what I had to learn on my own, I'd love to pass on to you so your speed bumps aren't as bad as mine were. Moving on to the coffee bean bag, I picked my favorite violet color family to color the bags. V91, V93, and V95. Just like the orange bag, I used V95 to color where I think the illustrator used their lines to add in creases and blend it out with the lighter markers. The more you practice coloring, the more comfortable you're going to get. And you'll start seeing on your own where shadows should appear. For example, I added darker color in the bottom corners of the front of the coffee bean bags. Not because I saw a line that was telling me to do it, but because I've colored enough and I've studied colored images enough to know adding those shadow lines will make a positive difference. And believe me, I don't consider myself an artist. I can barely draw a stick figure, but coloring is different, and that's because I practice. I've put in so many hours and I've used so much Copic ink and paper just on practicing. So I'm a huge advocate on practicing, and you'll probably hear me mention it, encouraging it in most of my videos. Getting back to the mouse, I picked warm grays to color him, keeping the grays light so he can either be a white mouse or a light gray one, however you want to see him. I used W1, W0, and W00. The one was a little too light for me, so I colored a light line of W3 to darken his right side. R20 and R00 were used again for the ears, tail, feet, and paws. Then I used the toner grays for the ground shadow, starting with T2 just to map everything out where I wanted the shadows to be. And then I moved on to T4, T6, and I'm going to use T0 to just blend everything out, and that's going to finish this panel. One last thing that I wanted to do before I was done with this project was incorporate a cute coffee pot stamp that's in the coffee house stamp set. So I decided to decorate matching envelope flaps with the stamp. I picked coordinating ink colors to match the envelope colors and used printer paper as a quick mask. I stuck printer paper behind the envelopes and under the flaps, and I started stamping away. I stamped my first image in the middle of the flap, and then I worked my way out so I didn't have any awkward spaces on the flap. This is a great way to use those accent stamps that are in your stamp sets that you might not know what to do with. I absolutely love the way that these envelopes turned out, and they're just a perfect addition to put those cards in and send out in the mail. Head over to my blog to learn more about this release and join a blog hop that's filled with designers that are sharing tips and ideas also. I had a lot of fun coloring, and it's been a while, so I'm really glad I just pulled out my Copic markers. I enjoyed sharing my process with you, and if you have any questions or thoughts, please leave them down below in the comment section. You'll also find links to all the products that I used today in my description box. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed your time, and I hope I was able to share some tips and inspiration with you. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I'll be back shortly with another video, so I'll see you then.